Admiral Chuichi Nagumo stood on the bridge of the aircraft carrier Akagi, watching the pre-dawn darkness stretch endlessly across the Pacific. The same waters that had witnessed Japan's stunning victory at Pearl Harbor 6 months earlier now seemed different, charged with an electric tension that made veteran sailors glance nervously at the horizon. What Nagumo didn't know was that his massive fleet was sailing directly into the most carefully orchestrated trap in naval history. The Japanese plan, conceived by Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto himself, was audacious in its scope. Operation MI would lure the remaining American Pacific Fleet into a decisive battle at Midway Atoll, a strategic speck of coral and sand 1,200 miles northwest of Hawaii. Yamamoto believed that by threatening this vital American outpost, he could force Admiral Chester Nimitz to commit his precious few remaining carriers to a fight they couldn't win. The mathematics seemed simple. Japan's first air fleet boasted 4 fleet carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, with over 200 experienced pilots who had honed their skills from China to Pearl Harbor. Against this armada, intelligence suggested the Americans could muster perhaps 2 carriers, maybe 3 if they were desperate enough to risk everything. But mathematics, as Nagumo would soon discover, told only part of the story. Hidden beneath the waves of the North Pacific, American codebreakers had performed a miracle that would reshape the entire war. Led by Commander Joseph Rochefort and his team of cryptanalysts at Station Hypo in Pearl Harbor, they had penetrated the Japanese naval code, JN-25, giving Nimitz an unprecedented view into enemy intentions. When intercepted messages spoke of an impending assault on AF, Rochefort's team devised an ingenious verification method. They instructed Midway to broadcast a fake message about their water purification system malfunctioning. Within days, Japanese communications referenced AF's water problems, confirming Midway as the target. According to declassified U.S. Navy records from the Naval Historical Center, this code-breaking achievement represented one of the most significant intelligence coups of the Second World War. Armed with this knowledge, Nimitz made a decision that would have seemed impossible weeks earlier. Rather than waiting passively for the Japanese assault, he would position his available forces, the carriers Enterprise, Hornet, and the hastily repaired Yorktown, northeast of Midway, perfectly positioned to strike the Japanese fleet when they least expected it. The trap was set with mathematical precision. While Japanese attention focused on Midway's defenses, American dive bombers would have a clear path to the heart of Nagumo's carrier force. As dawn broke on June 3rd, neither fleet was yet aware of the other's presence, but the stage was set for what would become known as the most decisive naval battle of the Pacific War. The morning sun illuminated a scene of deceptive calm, Japanese pilots preparing for what they believed would be another routine assault on an American garrison, while American air crews readied themselves for a battle that would determine whether Japan's 6-month reign of Pacific supremacy would continue or come to a catastrophic end. The dice were cast, the players positioned, and history held its breath as 2 great fleets approached their moment of destiny in the vast blue emptiness of the Pacific Ocean. Lieutenant Joichi Tominaga pressed his face against the cockpit glass of his Nakajima B-5N torpedo bomber, watching Midway Atoll emerge from the pre-dawn darkness like a sleeping giant. Behind him, 108 aircraft from the 1st Air Fleet spread across the sky in perfect formation. Dive bombers, torpedo planes, and fighters executing the kind of precision assault that had made the Japanese Naval Air Service the terror of the Pacific. What should have been a routine softening-up attack was about to trigger a chain of decisions that would seal the fate of the entire Japanese fleet. The attack on Midway began at 6:24 in the morning with devastating efficiency. Tominaga's bombers cratered the airfield while Zero fighters swept Marine defenders from the sky with ruthless professionalism. But as smoke rose from the American installations, Tominaga radioed a message that would prove catastrophic. There is need for a second attack wave. The defenses were stronger than expected, and Midway remained operational despite the pounding. Aboard the Akagi, Admiral Nagumo faced the first of several decisions that would haunt Japanese naval history. His second attack wave sat ready on the flight decks, armed with torpedoes and armor-piercing bombs for use against enemy ships. the very weapons needed if American carriers appeared. But Tomonaga's request seemed reasonable. Finish off Midway's defenses before the Americans could mount effective resistance. At 7:15, Nagumo gave the order that would doom his fleet. Rearm aircraft with bombs for second attack on Midway. What Nagumo couldn't know was that his every move was being observed from the sky. At 5:34 that morning, Ensign Jack Reed, piloting a lumbering PBY Catalina flying boat, had spotted the Japanese fleet through scattered clouds and transmitted the message that electrified the American command. Main body bearing 320, distance 180. For the first time since Pearl Harbor, the Americans knew exactly where the Japanese fleet was located, while Nagumo remained blind to the presence of 3 American carriers positioned perfectly for a devastating surprise attack. The rearming process aboard the Japanese carriers proceeded with practiced efficiency, but it created a window of vulnerability that experienced naval officers understood all too well. Torpedoes and armor-piercing bombs were struck below to the magazines, while high-explosive bombs were brought up and fitted to aircraft. For precious minutes, the hangar decks of all 4 carriers were cluttered with ordnance, fuel hoses, and aircraft in various stages of preparation. A tinderbox waiting for a spark. At 7:28, that spark nearly came. American torpedo bombers from Midway appeared on the horizon, flying their obsolete Douglas TBD Devastators straight into the teeth of Japanese defenses. The attack was suicidal in its courage and tragic in its futility. Zeros fell upon the slow-moving American aircraft like hawks on sparrows, shooting them down one after another until the ocean was littered with burning wreckage. Not a single torpedo found its target, but the attack served a purpose its pilots never knew. It pulled Japanese combat air patrol down to sea level and scattered it across miles of ocean. By 8:30, Nagumo believed the immediate threat had passed. His rearming operation was nearly complete, and Tomonaga's returning strike force circled overhead, low on fuel and demanding immediate landing. The admiral faced another crucial decision. Launch the second attack wave immediately, or recover the first wave and then launch a coordinated assault. Professional caution won out over aggressive instinct. At 8:35, Nagumo ordered the recovery of Tomonaga's aircraft, inadvertently ensuring that his flight decks would be cluttered with fuel hoses, and returning aircraft when the real American attack finally came. The morning sun climbed higher, and still no American ships appeared on the horizon. Perhaps Nagumo allowed himself to think the intelligence reports had been wrong. Perhaps there were no enemy carriers within striking distance after all. He would have his answer within the hour, and it would come from the sky like the wrath of an angry god. Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey banked his Douglas SBD Dauntless dive bomber into a wide turn, searching the empty Pacific for any sign of the Japanese fleet. His fuel gauge showed dangerously low levels, and behind him, 32 other dive bombers from the Enterprise followed in increasingly desperate search patterns. They should have found the enemy by now. Intelligence had been precise about the Japanese position, but the ocean below showed nothing but endless blue punctuated by scattered clouds. What McCluskey didn't know was that Admiral Nagumo had changed course twice since the American pilots had launched, first to close distance with Midway for the second attack, then northwest to avoid American land-based bombers. The mathematical precision of the American battle plan had been thrown into chaos by these seemingly minor course corrections, and now the most important attack of the Pacific War was minutes away from failure due to empty fuel tanks and navigational uncertainty. At 10:20, McCluskey made the decision that would change the course of World War II. Rather than turning back toward the Enterprise, he continued his search pattern northwestward, following his instincts and the sight of a lone Japanese destroyer racing across the water below. The destroyer Arashi was hurrying to rejoin the main fleet after dropping depth charges on an American submarine, and its white wake pointed like an arrow toward Admiral Nagumo's carriers. Meanwhile, on the flight deck of the Akagi, organized chaos reigned as the Japanese prepared for their decisive blow against the American fleet. Reconnaissance aircraft had finally spotted enemy carriers at 8:20, but the sighting report was maddeningly vague. 10 enemy surface ships bearing 010 degrees, distance 240 miles. Nagumo needed more information. How many carriers? What types of escort vessels? But precious minutes ticked away as he waited for clarification that would never come. Naval historians from the U.S. Naval War College have extensively documented how this crucial intelligence delay gave American forces the window they needed to achieve tactical surprise. The Japanese carriers presented a scene of barely controlled pandemonium. Flight decks were crowded with aircraft, some still being rearmed, others ready for launch but blocked by returning planes from the Midway strike. Fuel hoses snaked across the decks like deadly serpents, and ordnance handlers rushed to complete the complex dance of naval aviation warfare. Every experienced carrier sailor knew that this was the most dangerous moment in naval operations. Caught between offensive and defensive configurations, vulnerable to the kind of surprise attack that could destroy a fleet in minutes. At 10:24, McCluskey's gamble paid off. Through broken clouds 2 miles below, he spotted the geometric perfection of the Japanese fleet. 4 aircraft carriers in a rough square formation, surrounded by their escorts like gems in an elaborate setting. The Akagi and Kaga steamed to the north, while Soryu and Hiryu held position to the south. Each carrier was a floating city of steel and aviation fuel, packed with Japan's most experienced pilots and finest aircraft. But McCluskey saw something else that made his pulse quicken. The flight decks were cluttered with aircraft, fuel hoses, and personnel. The Japanese were caught in the most vulnerable position possible for an aircraft carrier, refueling and rearming operations in progress, with no defensive combat air patrol at altitude. The miracle he had hoped for had materialized below him like a vision from heaven. Without hesitation, McCluskey rolled his Dauntless into the steep dive that would echo through history. Behind him, his squadron followed in perfect formation, their 1,000-pound bombs armed and ready. As they plummeted toward the Kaga, McCluskey keyed his radio and transmitted the message that would announce the beginning of the end for Japanese naval supremacy. Attack! 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 At exactly 10:24 on the morning of June 4, 1942, the Pacific War reached its turning point. The next 4 minutes would witness destruction so complete and sudden that it would be studied by naval strategists for generations. A perfect demonstration of how quickly supremacy at sea could shift from one fleet to another. The age of Japanese dominance in the Pacific was about to end in fire and explosions. The first bomb struck the Akagi at 10:26, penetrating the flight deck near the aft elevator and exploding among the aircraft being refueled and rearmed below. Captain Taijiro Aoki felt his flagship shudder as secondary explosions began to ripple through the hangar deck, turning Japan's premier aircraft carrier into a floating inferno within seconds. On the bridge, Admiral Nagumo watched in stunned disbelief as the pride of the Imperial Navy transformed into a scene from hell, flames shooting hundreds of feet into the air, while his most experienced pilots died trapped in their cockpits. Simultaneously, 300 yards to port, the Kaga suffered an even more catastrophic fate. Lieutenant Dick Best, leading his section of dive bombers from the Enterprise, placed his 1,000-pound bomb directly into the carrier's forward elevator pit. The explosion ripped through 5 decks, igniting aviation fuel and ordnance that had been staged for the planned attack on American forces. Within minutes, the Kaga was completely enveloped in flames. Her flight deck buckled and twisted beyond recognition. But the American attack was far from over. Even as McCluskey's Enterprise bombers were pulling out of their dives, Lieutenant Commander Maxwell Leslie appeared overhead with his squadron from the Yorktown. Leslie had lost his bomb due to an electrical malfunction during the long flight, but his wingmen were fully armed and ready for battle. At 10:25, they rolled into their attack runs against the Soryu, Japan's newest and most advanced carrier. Captain Ryusaku Yanagimoto stood on the Soryu's bridge watching death approach from the sky, with the stoic calm that had made him one of Japan's most respected naval officers. He had time for one final command. All hands, prepare for impact. Then the bombs struck. 3 direct hits in rapid succession turned the Soryu into a floating funeral pyre, her hangar deck exploding with such violence that the concussion could be felt on ships miles away. In less than 4 minutes, Three of Japan's four fleet carriers had been reduced to burning hulks, their veteran air crews dead or dying, their carefully trained pilots trapped in blazing metal coffins. The mathematical precision of Japanese naval planning had been shattered by American determination and extraordinary luck. What had begun as Japan's attempt to destroy the American Pacific Fleet had become the greatest naval disaster in Japanese history. Aboard the sole surviving carrier Hiryu, Rear Admiral Taman Yamaguchi assessed the catastrophe with the cold professionalism that had made him one of Japan's most promising naval commanders. His carrier was undamaged, her aircraft ready for action, but he was now facing three American carriers with only one Japanese carrier remaining operational. The odds had shifted dramatically against Japan, but Yamaguchi was not a man to surrender without a fight. "Prepare immediate attack," he ordered his air operations officer. "All available aircraft against the enemy carriers. We will show them that the spirit of Japan cannot be broken by a single lucky strike." Within minutes, 18 dive bombers and 6 fighters were launched from the Hiryu's deck, racing toward the American fleet, with revenge burning in their hearts. The attack found its target in the Yorktown, already damaged from the Battle of the Coral Sea, but hastily repaired and pressed into service for this crucial engagement. At 12:10, Japanese dive bombers struck the American carrier with 3 bombs, causing severe damage and forcing her crew to begin damage control procedures. For a moment, it seemed as though Japanese determination might salvage something from the disaster. But Admiral Raymond Spruance, commanding the American task force from the Enterprise, was already planning his response. The mathematical advantage now lay overwhelmingly with American forces. 2 undamaged carriers against 1 Japanese carrier, with experienced pilots who had just proven their ability to devastate enemy forces. The second American attack wave was already preparing for launch, and this time there would be no navigational errors or missed opportunities. The 4 minutes from 10:24 to 10:28 on June 4, 1942, had fundamentally altered the balance of power in the Pacific. Japan's 6-month reign of naval supremacy was ending in smoke and flames, while American forces prepared to press their unexpected advantage to its logical conclusion. The Battle of Midway was far from over, but its outcome was no longer in doubt. Rear Admiral Taman Yamaguchi stood on the bridge of the Hiryu, watching black smoke columns mark the graves of his sister carriers on the horizon. The Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu, the backbone of Japan's naval aviation, were dying slowly in the afternoon sun, their fires visible for miles across the Pacific. Yamaguchi had earned his reputation as one of Japan's most aggressive commanders, and even facing impossible odds, he refused to consider retreat. If this was to be the end of the First Air Fleet, he would ensure that Japan's enemies paid dearly for their victory. His first revenge had already struck home. The American carrier Yorktown lay dead in the water, her flight deck twisted by Japanese bombs, and her crew fighting desperately to save their ship. But Yamaguchi knew that damaging one enemy carrier was insufficient payment for the loss of 3 Japanese flat tops. He needed to strike again, and strike decisively, before American forces could organize another devastating attack. At 1400 hours, the Hiryu launched her second strike of the day. 10 torpedo bombers and 6 fighters, led by Lieutenant Joichi Tominaga, the same pilot who had led the morning attack on Midway. Tominaga's aircraft had been damaged in that earlier mission, his fuel tank holed by American defensive fire, but the veteran pilot refused to stand down from what everyone knew would be the final Japanese offensive of the battle. The torpedo attack found the Yorktown's crew still struggling with damage control. Her elevators jammed, and her flight deck partially cleared for emergency operations. At 14:45, Tominaga's bombers swept in at wave-top height, their torpedoes striking the carrier's port side with devastating effect. The explosions flooded the Yorktown's engine rooms, leaving her completely powerless and listing heavily to port. For the second time in 3 hours, the American carrier seemed doomed. But even as the Yorktown absorbed her death blow, American vengeance was already airborne. Lieutenant Commander Clarence Wade McCluskey, the same pilot whose navigation had found the Japanese fleet that morning, was leading 24 dive bombers from the Enterprise in a direct assault on the Hiryu. This time, There would be no navigational uncertainty, no lucky breaks needed. American radar had tracked the Japanese strikes back to their source, providing precise coordinates for the final act of the battle. At 1700 hours, McCluskey's dive bombers appeared over the Hiryu like avenging angels. Captain Tomeo Kaku, the carrier's commanding officer, had time for one final radio message to Admiral Yamamoto. "We are under attack by enemy dive bombers. We'll fight to the end." Then the bombs began to fall with the mechanical precision that had characterized American attacks throughout this extraordinary day. 4 direct hits transformed the Hiryu from a functioning warship into a blazing wreck within minutes. Unlike her sister ships, which had been caught with armed aircraft and fuel hoses on deck, the Hiryu had been cleared for flight operations, but the bombs penetrated her flight deck and exploded in her hangar spaces with such force that secondary explosions continued for hours, each one sending shockwaves through the surrounding water. Admiral Yamaguchi, watching his flagship die around him, made a decision that epitomized the samurai spirit that had driven Japanese expansion across the Pacific. Rather than abandon ship and face the disgrace of survival, he chose to remain aboard the burning carrier with Captain Kaku. Their final radio message to the fleet was tersely professional. "Hiryu proceeding north, damage severe. Will engage enemy until ammunition expended." According to records from the Japanese Naval General Staff preserved in the National Archives, this decision reflected the profound shock within Japanese command at the scale of the disaster unfolding at Midway. As evening fell over the Pacific battlefield, the mathematics of naval warfare had been completely reversed. That morning, Japan had possessed 4 fleet carriers with over 200 experienced aircraft and pilots. By sunset, all 4 carriers were either sunk or sinking, their air groups decimated, and their irreplaceable veteran pilots dead or dying in the water. American losses, while significant, paled in comparison. One carrier heavily damaged and eventually sunk, with aircraft losses that could be replaced within months rather than years. The strategic implications were staggering. Japan's ability to project naval air power across the vast Pacific had been shattered in a single day. The initiative that had carried Japanese forces from Pearl Harbor to the edges of Australia was broken, never to be recovered. Admiral Yamamoto's gamble to destroy the American Pacific Fleet had instead resulted in the destruction of Japan's own naval supremacy. As darkness settled over the battle zone, both fleets began the grim process of assessing their losses and planning their next moves. But the outcome was already clear to experienced naval officers on both sides. June 4th, 1942, would be remembered as the day American forces turned the tide in the Pacific War. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto stood in the operations room of the battleship Yamato, staring at the radio messages that detailed the complete destruction of his carefully planned offensive. The man who had orchestrated the attack on Pearl Harbor, who had warned his government that Japan could run wild for 6 months before American industrial might begin to tell, now faced the bitter reality that those 6 months had ended in catastrophic defeat 300 miles from Midway Atoll. The final reports from the burning carriers made for devastating reading. The Akagi, his former flagship and the pride of Japanese naval aviation, had been abandoned at 1920 after fires made her position untenable. The Kaga had suffered an even worse fate, exploding with such violence that debris rained down on nearby destroyers. The Soryu had gone down fighting, her captain choosing death over the dishonor of surrender. And now the Hiryu, the last of his fleet carriers, was reporting uncontrollable fires and requesting permission to scuttle. Yamamoto's staff officers waited in uncomfortable silence as their commander processed the magnitude of the disaster. Captain Kuroshima, his senior planner, finally broke the quiet with a suggestion that bordered on desperation. "Admiral, we still have our battleship force. We could proceed with the invasion of Midway under cover of darkness. Our surface units are more than sufficient to deal with whatever American forces remain." The suggestion was tactically sound but strategically meaningless, and Yamamoto knew it. Without air cover, his battleships would be sitting targets for American land-based bombers from Midway and Hawaii. More importantly, the fundamental purpose of Operation MI had been to destroy American carrier forces in decisive battle. Instead, he had accomplished precisely the opposite. His own carrier forces were destroyed, while American flat tops remained largely intact. At 0400 hours, Yamamoto made the decision that would haunt him for the remainder of his life. Signal all units. Operation MI is cancelled. Fleet will retire to base immediately. The most ambitious Japanese offensive of the Pacific War was over, ending not in glorious victory but in strategic catastrophe. But the true cost of Midway extended far beyond the loss of 4 aircraft carriers. In the blazing wreckage of the Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu lay the irreplaceable core of Japanese naval aviation. Veteran pilots who had trained for years, maintenance crews who understood the intricate technology of carrier operations, and air group commanders whose tactical expertise had been honed in combat from China to Pearl Harbor. These men could not be replaced quickly, if at all. Lieutenant Commander John Waldron, leading his torpedo squadron from the Hornet, had predicted this outcome in his final letter to his wife. "If we don't come back, at least you'll know that we went down fighting and took as many of them with us as we could." His entire squadron had been shot down attacking the Japanese carriers, but their sacrifice had helped create the conditions for American victory. The mathematics of aerial warfare were brutal. Experienced pilots were far more valuable than the aircraft they flew, and Japan had just lost hundreds of irreplaceable aviators in a single day. Declassified Japanese military records analyzed by the National Institute for Defense Studies reveal that the pilot losses at Midway crippled Japanese carrier operations for the remainder of the war. American losses, while painful, were strategically manageable. The Yorktown had finally succumbed to her damage, breaking in half and sinking on June 7th after valiant damage control efforts. But her air groups had largely survived, and American industrial capacity was already producing replacement carriers at a pace that Japanese planners found incomprehensible. The Essex-class carriers rolling off American shipyards would soon give the U.S. Navy numerical superiority that Japan could never hope to match. As dawn broke on June 5th, rescue operations began across hundreds of square miles of Pacific Ocean. Japanese destroyers pulled survivors from the water, while American forces conducted their own searches for downed air crews. The human cost of the battle was becoming clear. Nearly 3,000 Japanese sailors and airmen were dead or missing, compared to approximately 300 American casualties. Admiral Chester Nimitz, receiving reports of the victory at his Pearl Harbor headquarters, understood immediately that the entire strategic situation in the Pacific had been transformed. "The Japanese will never again have the capability to mount major offensive operations," he told his staff. "From this point forward, we hold the initiative." The age of Japanese expansion was over. The long road back to Tokyo was about to begin, and it would be paved with the wreckage of Yamamoto's ambition and the courage of men who had fought and died in the blue waters around Midway Atoll. Admiral Chester Nimitz walked slowly along the docks of Pearl Harbor, where 6 months earlier, the twisted wreckage of American battleships had symbolized the apparent collapse of U.S. naval power in the Pacific. Now, as he watched the damaged but victorious Enterprise and Hornet return from Midway, he understood that the strategic balance of the entire war had shifted irrevocably. The Japanese gamble to eliminate American carrier forces had instead resulted in the destruction of Japan's own naval aviation capabilities, marking the beginning of the end for the empire of the rising sun. The final tally of the Battle of Midway read like a mathematical equation that had solved itself in America's favor. Japan had lost 4 fleet carriers, 1 heavy cruiser, and approximately 300 aircraft, with nearly 3,000 casualties among their most experienced naval aviators and sailors. American losses, while significant, paled in comparison. 1 fleet carrier, 1 destroyer, and 150 aircraft, with total casualties of approximately 300 men. But these raw numbers told only part of the story. The true strategic impact lay in what military historians would later call the irreplaceable factor. Japan's veteran pilots, trained over years of careful instruction and combat experience, were gone forever. The aircraft carriers could theoretically be replaced, though Japan's industrial capacity was already stretched to its limits, but the human expertise that made carrier aviation effective had been largely eliminated in 4 catastrophic minutes on June 4th. American pilot training programs, by contrast, were producing thousands of new aviators monthly, backed by an industrial infrastructure that would deliver 24 Essex-class carriers before the war's end. Emperor Hirohito, receiving news of the defeat in his private chambers, reportedly stood in silence for several minutes before speaking. The war situation has developed not necessarily to Japan's advantage. This masterpiece of understatement reflected the shock that reverberated through Japanese leadership as they grasped the magnitude of their loss. The 6 months of easy victories that had carried Japanese forces from Pearl Harbor to the edges of Australia and India were over, replaced by the grim reality of industrial warfare against an opponent whose productive capacity dwarfed their own. Historian Samuel Eliot Morison, in his authoritative 15-volume History of United States Naval Operations in World War II, described Midway as the most important naval battle since Trafalgar for its strategic consequences. Admiral Yamamoto, the architect of Japan's naval strategy, understood better than most the implications of Midway's outcome. His pre-war warning that Japan could run wild for 6 months before American strength began to tell had proven prophetic. Those 6 months had ended not with the decisive victory he had sought, but with the destruction of the very forces that had made Japanese expansion possible. From this point forward, Japan would fight a defensive war against increasingly overwhelming odds. The psychological impact extended far beyond military circles. Throughout the Japanese Empire, populations who had celebrated an unbroken string of victories suddenly faced the reality that their forces were not invincible. In America, by contrast, the victory at Midway provided the first clear evidence that Japanese expansion could be stopped and reversed. War-bond drives, industrial production, and military recruitment all received tremendous boosts from news of the victory. President Franklin Roosevelt, addressing the nation from the White House, carefully avoided revealing the intelligence breakthrough that had made victory possible while emphasizing the heroism of American airmen. The courage and sacrifice of our naval aviators at Midway have turned the tide of this war. The Japanese naval force has suffered a decisive defeat, from which it will not recover. His words proved prophetic. Japan would never again possess the naval aviation strength to mount major offensive operations. The strategic initiative in the Pacific had passed permanently to American forces. Within months, American Marines would land at Guadalcanal, beginning the long island-hopping campaign that would carry them to the shores of Japan itself. Each subsequent battle would demonstrate the growing disparity between Japanese and American capabilities, as new American carriers joined the fleet, while Japan struggled to replace the losses suffered at Midway. As the sun set over Pearl Harbor on June 7, 1942, the Pacific War entered its decisive phase. The Battle of Midway had proven that courage, preparation, and industrial might could overcome even the most carefully planned surprise attack. Japan's grip on the Pacific, which had seemed unbreakable just a week earlier, had been shattered by the determination of men who refused to accept defeat, and the intelligence breakthrough that gave them the chance to prove their worth. The road to victory would be long and costly, but after Midway, its destination was no longer in doubt.